Now we will discuss whole object bias and taxonomic bias. As children are exposed to adult words, especially the words which are there for the objects, many references are possible for these words, and it becomes very difficult for children to look at multiple meanings that they come across. So this particular constraint is considered as cognitive constraint, and under these constraints we have whole object bias and taxonomic bias. Whole object assumption is where you have, if a child is given a name for the object, a child will assume that that particular name or a word is going to cover all the characteristics of that object. For example, if the adult points out to an object and tells the child that it's a truck, the child will assume that a truck covers all the characteristics of that object, which means tires, colors, or you can have other parts, doors of that object. So initially they begin this thematic relationship, which means that if a word is given soup, the child would relate it to a ball and spoon. Now if a new label is given, then children will shift their relationship towards from thematic relationship to taxonomic relationship. For example, if considering the same example where there's a soup, now in the taxonomic relationship the child would relate a soup to maybe ice cream or pudding instead of a ball or spoon. So these are some of the cognitive constraints in terms of whole object bias and taxonomic bias. Now we will look at the whole object bias and taxonomic bias and see what are some of the examples that are there. Now, as we have discussed, when children encounter a new label, they prefer to attach the label to the entire object rather than to part of the object. Now, I have already given the example where, let's say, a child is shown and given the label truck, and the child will assume truck refers to the whole object and instead of the tires, doors, colors and other parts. Now if a researcher points to an object while simultaneously saying a new name, children will assume that the new label refers to the whole object. Now in this situation, Alan Markman pioneered work in this field, deals with this particular aspect of whole object bias thing. Now her studies suggest that even in cases where color or dynamic activity are made salient to children specifically, they will still interpret the new word as a label for whole object. Furthermore, infants hold a primitive theory of physical world that is guided by three constraints on the behavior of physical bodies. Objects must move as whole, objects move independently of each other, and objects move on connected paths. It is suggested that these three constraints help guide children's interpretation of scenes and in turn explains how the whole object bias reflects the non-linguistic status of objects. Now we have taxonomic bias. Now children will assume that the object label is taxonomic category rather than a name for an individual. Now in a situation where someone points to an object and says dog, the child assumes that the word is a label for the entire object rather than the dog's tail. So considering this same example here, that they will assume that taxonomic category, a name for an individual dog, for example, they will assume that dog is the label for a group of animals. Ordinarily, children focus on thematic relations between objects when characterizing. If given milk, a spoon, or a car, children will group each item with a cow, soup, or a stop sign, respectively. However, when children hear a new label, they shift their attention from thematic relationship to taxonomic relationship, even though they consider thematic relations to be a good way of recognizing objects themselves. The new word is assumed to refer to other objects within the same taxonomic category. Now, Allen's early work in this area dealt with this constraint at work when 2 and 3-year-old were presented with two basic level objects, two different kind of dogs, and a third thematically related object, dog food. They showed a tendency to select a dog and dog food. However, if one of the dogs was labeled with an unfamiliar word, the children were more likely to select the two dogs. To conclude, word learning biases are certain biases or assumptions that allow children to quickly rule out unlikely alternatives. When a child learns a new word, they must decide whether the word refers to the whole object, part of the object, its substance, color, or texture.